The neighborhood was the definition of picture perfect. Identical white fences, flower beds trimmed with military precision, and an HOA that ruled like a dictatorship. I had barely lived here for 2 weeks when I got my first taste of their power. Margaret Wilkins, the HOA president, ran things with the efficiency of a tyrant. Strict parking rules, hefty fines, and an unspoken rule that she always got the final say. The problem? I had just bought a brand new BMW M5, and despite parking it neatly in my own driveway, I woke up one morning to find it gone, towed. I had no idea that tiny power move would start a war. What they didn't know, I owned the very company they called to do their dirty work. I stood in my empty driveway, staring at the oil-stained pavement where my BMW had been parked just hours ago. At first I thought it had been stolen, until I noticed the fluorescent pink, unauthorized parking violation notice stuck to my mailbox, signed with the sharp, looping signature of Margaret Wilkins. My stomach tightened. I hadn't violated any parking rules. My car was on my property. But the notice claimed that the HOA's bylaws forbade luxury vehicles left in driveways overnight because it disrupted the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood. Absolute nonsense. I dialed the number at the bottom of the notice, the towing company contracted by the HOA, and my phone buzzed in my hand the moment the call connected. The office manager, Sophie Klein, picked up, her voice amused. "Ethan, I was just about to call you. We got a tow order last night. Figured you'd want to see this." I already knew what she was hinting at. I owned the towing company. Every tow order, every HOA complaint, every single ridiculous violation that led to a car being hauled away, it all crossed my desk, and now they had unknowingly messed with the wrong person. I clenched the notice in my fist. Margaret thought she was untouchable, lording over the neighborhood with her absurd fines and rules. She had no idea I could flip the entire game board in an instant. The HOA office sat at the heart of the neighborhood, a sterile little building with beige walls and perfectly manicured bushes that somehow felt more like a courthouse than a community center. I pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped into the cool, artificially scented air, my footsteps muted by the plush gray carpet that absorbed sound like a confession booth. Behind the reception desk, a middle-aged woman with thin lips and horn-rimmed glasses looked up from her computer, her expression neutral, but her eyes flickering with recognition. Before I could speak, she pressed a button on her desk phone. "Margaret, he's here," she said flatly, as if my arrival had been inevitable, as if I had been expected the moment my car disappeared. If you've made it this far and are enjoying the drama of these HOA stories, you're not alone. Don't miss out on the rest of the story. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for even more shocking twists. A second later, the door to the inner office swung open, and there she was, Margaret Wilkins, HOA president, self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, standing with her arms folded and a practiced, patronizing smile. She was the type of woman who wielded rules like weapons, someone who took pleasure in the fine print and delighted in turning bureaucracy into a battlefield. Her blonde bob was immaculately styled, her pressed navy blazer crisp, her entire presence exuding the smug confidence of someone who believed they had already won. "Mr. Cole," she said smoothly, tilting her head just enough to give the illusion of politeness, "I assume you're here about your vehicle." I held up the violation notice. The paper crumpled from where I had clenched it on the way over. "Explain to me how parking in my own driveway violates HOA policy." Margaret let out a small, controlled laugh, the kind that people use when they think they're speaking to someone beneath them. "Ah, yes, we have strict guidelines regarding the aesthetic harmony of our community. We wouldn't want an unsightly display." Her words dripped with condescension, a calculated insult wrapped in official language. But I didn't take the bait. Instead, I smiled, slow, deliberate, just enough for her to notice, but not enough for her to understand why. I had the power here. She just didn't know it yet. I didn't argue, didn't push, didn't even raise my voice. That would have been too easy for Margaret. She thrived on conflict, on watching people squirm under the weight of her authority. No, I had something better. Instead of reacting, I let silence settle between us, let her believe that she had just put me in my place. I watched as the corners of her mouth twitched with satisfaction, as her grip on her clipboard tightened just slightly, As if preparing for the next wave of complaints she was certain would come. Then, with deliberate ease, I pulled out my phone, tapped a few times, and turned the screen toward her. A live feed blinked to life, a security camera recording from my own towing lot, clear as daylight, time-stamped and irrefutable. In the footage, a tow truck, my tow truck, pulled into the lot just past midnight, hauling a sleek, deep blue BMW M5. My car. The driver, Luis, hopped out, scanned the order, and exchanged a confused glance with the woman standing beside him. A woman wearing a blazer, a woman I had never seen set foot in my business before, but whose posture and stance were unmistakable, even in grainy black and white resolution. Margaret Wilkins. Her carefully controlled expression faltered, just for a fraction of a second, but it was there. That was all I needed. "You seem to have taken a personal interest in my car," I said smoothly, my voice even, controlled, but carrying just enough weight to let her know that I was no longer just another resident following her rules. Her lips parted, the moment stretching between us like a rope pulled taut, the first strand of her control beginning to unravel. Margaret's confident mask cracked for just a moment, a brief flicker of uncertainty in her eyes before she quickly regained her composure. The lines around her mouth tightened, her fingers tapping rhythmically against her clipboard, as if willing herself to calm down. But the damage was done. I had seen it, the one crack in her ironclad armor, and I knew that once something like that slipped, it was only a matter of time before the whole structure came crumbling down. She took a long breath, straightening her posture. "Ethan," she said, her tone turning cold and formal, the warmth gone entirely from her voice. "I'm not sure what you think you're insinuating, but I don't appreciate being threatened." It was a feeble attempt to regain dominance, and we both knew it. She wasn't used to people challenging her, especially not in her own domain. I leaned back slightly in my chair, giving her the space to stew in her own discomfort. The only sound between us was the soft hum of the air conditioner. Behind Margaret, I could see Stanley Riggs, the former lawyer and loyal board member, standing in the doorway, arms crossed, silently observing. He had always been a shadow, hovering in the background, waiting for someone to cross Marge. Stanley's eyes locked onto mine for a brief moment, intense, sharp, but then he quickly looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was heading. Across the room, Lana Brooks, the timid board member who usually preferred to remain neutral, was fiddling with her pen, glancing nervously between Margaret and me, as though unsure whether to align herself with the power-hungry president or the quiet outsider who had just turned the tables. "Mr. Cole," Margaret continued, her voice now strained but steady, "this is a misunderstanding. Let's resolve this civilly." She reached for her phone, no doubt preparing to spin the situation to her favor. But as she fumbled with her device, I knew there was no fixing this. Not for her. The war had begun, and her first move had already backfired. The next few days passed in a blur, but they weren't the quiet kind of blur. No, things moved too quickly for that. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Margaret's tight grip on the HOA was starting to slip, and everyone could feel it, even the ones who kept their heads down. People started talking, whispering behind their manicured hedges, their perfectly trimmed lawns. I knew this wasn't just about my car anymore. This had become something much larger. A quiet rebellion had started, one I hadn't expected, but now couldn't ignore. Paul Henderson, a longtime resident who had suffered under Margaret's iron-fisted rule for years, cornered me in the grocery store a few days after my showdown at the HOA office. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial, as he slid a piece of paper across the counter. "I've got the rest of her records," he said, eyes darting nervously around. "Towing invoices, fines, violations, all of it. She's been using this whole system to line her own pockets, Ethan, just waiting for someone to notice." I glanced down at the papers, the weight of what Paul had just handed me settling in. I'd known Margaret was corrupt, but seeing the details, evidence of her collusion with the towing company, of her financial manipulation, was a different kind of revelation. The power she wielded wasn't just about control, it was about profit. The system was rigged, and she was at the top, benefiting from every single fine, every car towed, every rule she imposed. The revelation hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment I stood frozen in the middle of the store, the paper burning a hole in my hands. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every person who had ever been targeted by her greed. But with this new weapon came a new set of problems. If I exposed her, she would come at me harder than ever, and now I had to consider what that would mean for my business, for the people who worked for me, for the neighborhood itself. Could I take her down without destroying everything else? As the days wore on, the stakes of this battle became painfully clear, not just in the form of mounting pressure from Margaret's attacks, but in the quiet, invisible toll it was taking on my life. The neighborhood that had once felt like a fresh start, a place of peace and luxury, now seemed like a battlefield. Every time I stepped outside, there was a whisper in the air, a subtle change in the way people looked at me, like they knew I was on the verge of something big, but no one knew what side to take. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from employees, from neighbors, from people I didn't even know. Some offered support, others hinted at scandalous details they'd uncovered about Margaret's business dealings. And then there was Sophie, the office manager of the towing company, who had been my rock through it all. She sent me a message late one night. "You know we can't back out of this now, Ethan. We've got everything we need to bring her down, but I'm worried. About you. About what it'll cost." I sat there, staring at the words. I had been so focused on the war ahead that I hadn't stopped to consider what it would mean for me personally. I was playing a dangerous game, and with every move I made, the stakes grew higher. My business, my livelihood, could fall apart if this backfired. I had already lost some clients to fear of the HOA's retaliation, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was jeopardizing everything I had worked for. But then I remembered the countless neighbors who were too scared to speak out, the families who had been fined for trivial things, the elderly couple who couldn't even afford the towing fee. I couldn't back down. The cost was real, but I had to see this through. The night felt thick with tension, like the calm before a storm that no one wanted to acknowledge, but everyone could sense. I had spent hours poring over the evidence, mapping out a plan to expose Margaret's corruption, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play. It wasn't just about her anymore. There were too many moving parts, too many people with their own agendas, too many dark corners in this seemingly perfect little neighborhood. Then it came. A message from Mike, the head of my towing team. His voice on the phone was low, urgent. "Ethan, I think I've found something. We've got a new client. High-end, real estate, the kind of money Margaret likes. But when I looked up the address, it didn't match the property listed." Mike's words hit me like a slap in the face. He had uncovered a legal loophole, something that would have been almost impossible to trace without careful scrutiny. Margaret had been moving assets, laundering money through real estate deals that no one had paid attention to. It wasn't just the towing and fines. It was about hiding large sums of money, shifting wealth under the radar of the law. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was bigger than I thought. And it wasn't just about her misusing HOA power. It was about her feeding from a much darker, more complex system of manipulation. She wasn't the only one pulling strings. As if on cue, my phone buzzed again. Another message. This time from Lana Brooks. "Ethan, I need to talk to you. I know what Margaret's doing, and I don't want to be part of it anymore, but I need your help." The walls were closing in. People who had been silent for so long were now starting to see the cracks in the system, and they were reaching out, desperate for change. But I knew better than to trust anyone too quickly. The game had just become more dangerous. The pieces were falling into place, but with each move the risk grew. I knew I couldn't go after Margaret directly without giving her a chance to strike first. She was too well placed, too entrenched in the community's systems. The public humiliation of her towing scandal wouldn't be enough. I needed something that would leave her vulnerable, exposed, something she couldn't control. It wasn't just about destroying her. It was about unraveling everything she had built, forcing the entire system to collapse on itself. I pulled Mike and Luis into my plan, the two men who had been with me from the beginning, who understood the risks but also shared my determination. We worked late, hours bleeding into the night, as I laid out the details of our move. Sophie kept the records, filing away every tow order, every invoice, every violation. I was going to use those records as the perfect weapon, tying Margaret's financial dealings to the illegal towing contracts. I couldn't do this alone. I needed Lana, but could I trust her? She was the wild card, the one person who had been close enough to Margaret to know all her secrets, but she had played both sides for far too long. I called her that evening, her name flashing on the screen with an air of finality. "Lana," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I'm moving forward with this. You're either with me or you're not. But if you are, it's all in. Everything. No turning back." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she spoke, it was with a quiet, resolute tone, a shift from the indecisiveness I had always seen in her before. "I'm in. But you need to know, this will ruin everything. Your business, your reputation. If you do this, there's no going back." Her words weighed heavy in the silence, and I felt the gravity of what we were about to do. But there was no other option now. Margaret had pushed too far, and I had found a way to make her pay for it. We set the plan in motion. Sophie was already organizing the paperwork, while Mike and Luis prepared the next batch of tow orders. But as we moved forward, I felt a creeping sense of unease. Margaret was no fool. She would react, and she would react violently. The night before we executed our plan, the tension in the air felt almost unbearable. I sat in my office, the soft hum of the overhead lights providing the only sound as I stared at the stack of evidence in front of me. This was it, the moment everything would change. My fingers hovered over the papers, each one detailing Margaret's shady dealings, the illegal contracts, the hidden money laundering schemes. I could feel the weight of the decision pressing against my chest, but there was no turning back now. If I didn't do this, I would be letting her continue to destroy people's lives. The next morning, the plan went into motion. Sophie delivered the documents to the local news station, carefully timed to land in the hands of investigative reporters. Mike and Luis were on standby, ready to execute a series of tows that would serve as a signal, the first phase of unraveling Margaret's network. I knew it would draw attention, lots of it. The trick was to keep it controlled, to make sure the pieces fell exactly where I needed them. Just as we began, the unexpected happened. I received a message from Lana, the one person I had counted on to keep her end of the bargain. But the message wasn't what I expected. "Ethan, I've made a mistake. Margaret knows what you're doing. She's coming for you. Get out now while you can." My heart skipped a beat as I read the message again, trying to process the words. Margaret had been one step ahead of us. She had known the whole time, watching, waiting for the right moment to destroy everything I had built. I stood up, pacing the room, my thoughts spiraling. This wasn't just a battle for control anymore. It was a fight for survival. I had to make a choice. Do I back down now and retreat, giving Margaret everything she wanted? Or do I push forward, risking everything, knowing she would stop at nothing to protect her empire? The walls were closing in, and there was no safe way out. The choice was simple. The only way out was through. The phone call came as I was walking toward my car, the weight of the decision already pressing heavy on my shoulders. I hadn't expected it to come so soon, but it was inevitable. Margaret had been cornered, and now she was making her move. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a sharp buzz that sliced through the tension that had built up over the last few days. I didn't even have to look at the screen to know who it was. It was her. The moment I answered, her voice was cold, a steel blade wrapped in honeyed words. "Ethan, you think you can take me down? You're mistaken." I didn't speak at first, just listened as she let her words linger like poison in the air between us. "I've spent years building this," she continued, her tone becoming more venomous with each passing word. "Do you think you can just waltz in and undo all of that? I own this place. I control everything here, and everyone knows it. You don't have the power to change anything." I could feel the weight of her words, but they didn't rattle me the way they once would have. This time, there was no fear in my chest, no uncertainty. There was only the calm, determined resolve of someone who had already made peace with the consequences. "You're right," I said, my voice steady, matching her icy tone. "You've controlled this place for far too long, but I'm done playing by your rules. This ends now." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear her heart race, her mind scrambling for the next move. She had always been in control, always had the upper hand. But that was before I'd seen through her lies, before I had exposed her corruption to the world. The pieces had already started to fall, and I knew the moment had come. "You'll regret this," she spat, the words dripping with venom. But I wasn't listening anymore. I had already made my move. I arrived at the HOA office just as the sun was beginning to set, the sky painted in shades of fiery orange and blood red, as though the world itself was mirroring the storm that was about to break. The moment I stepped into the building, the atmosphere shifted, thickening with an intensity I could taste in the air. Every pair of eyes in the room was trained on me, and I could feel the weight of their silent judgment. The tension crackled like static, a hum of anticipation that made my skin crawl. Margaret stood behind the reception desk, arms crossed, her face set in a mask of barely concealed fury. Stanley, Lana, and the others stood off to the side, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, fear, and barely disguised anxiety. Margaret had gathered them all here, likely to make one final stand, one last desperate attempt to salvage her reign. But it was already too late. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I pulled out the folder containing the evidence I had carefully pieced together over the last few days. Every tow order, every false violation, every corrupt transaction she had made. I dropped it onto the desk between us, the sound of the papers slapping against the wood echoing through the room like a gunshot. Margaret's eyes flickered over the documents, her face paling as she saw the irrefutable proof of her crimes. For the first time, I saw her falter, just a crack in the armor she had so carefully built. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, but I could hear the desperation beneath the surface. "I've worked too hard for this, too long." I didn't respond. I didn't have to. The truth spoke for itself, and with each piece of evidence laid bare, the walls around her crumbled. The power she had so carefully hoarded was slipping from her grasp, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The others in the room shifted uncomfortably, some of them stepping forward, some retreating. Stanley, usually so unshakable, looked like a man caught in a storm, his mouth tight, his hands trembling. But Margaret? She stood there, frozen, the facade of control slipping away piece by piece. This was it, the end of her reign, the moment when her empire crumbled, and she realized that her carefully crafted world was nothing more than a house of cards. The silence in the room was deafening, the weight of the truth hanging like a guillotine above us, poised to fall. Margaret stood frozen, her fingers trembling as she gripped the edge of the desk, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She had built her empire on manipulation, on exploiting the fears of the people around her, and now it was all coming undone. The power she had clung to for so long was slipping away, piece by piece, and she was finally realizing the depths of her own vulnerability. I took a step closer, letting the tension hang in the air a moment longer before I spoke. My voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried a weight that seemed to draw the room's attention to me. "This ends now, Margaret. You'll step down, or I'll make sure every single piece of this gets into the right hands. The press, the authorities, everyone you've manipulated. You can't hide behind your rules anymore. You've already lost." Her face twisted in a mix of fury and disbelief. "You think you've won?" She spat, her voice rising in pitch, cracking with the desperation of someone who could see their entire world collapsing around them. "I'll make sure you regret this. You think they'll listen to you? They'll never believe you." I didn't flinch. I had already played my hand. The documents had already been delivered to the news, the authorities, and the legal system. I'd made sure of it. I had already crossed the line into a war I couldn't walk away from, but that didn't matter anymore. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about righting the wrongs she had forced on people for far too long. As I turned to leave, I could feel the eyes of the room on my back, the weight of their judgment gone. For the first time, the room felt lighter, the air less oppressive. I didn't need to watch Margaret's reaction. I knew what would come next, her public humiliation, her downfall. But I also knew that the fight wasn't over yet. The damage had been done, and the community was already starting to shift. The pieces had already been set into motion, and now the rest of the world would see her for what she truly was. This was my victory, But it wasn't just mine. It was for every single person who had ever been silenced by her reign. And with that, I walked out of the office, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. In the days that followed, the neighborhood felt different. The weight that had pressed down on everyone for so long was finally lifting, the oppressive control of the HOA crumbling like a fragile house of cards. Margaret's downfall had been swift, brutal, and public, and though I could feel a strange sense of satisfaction, I also felt the quiet emptiness that came with winning a battle that had cost me so much. It was strange, really. The world outside was the same, sunlight glinting off car hoods, the soft hum of distant traffic, the sound of children playing in the yards, but everything felt different, somehow. There was a shift in the air, a change that I couldn't quite explain. The truth had been exposed, but the scars were still there. People had been manipulated for years, too afraid to speak up, too terrified of what would happen if they did. I stood at the edge of the park, my hands in my pockets, watching the people go about their daily lives. It felt like the calm after a storm, the kind of peace that settled into your bones, but didn't quite erase the memory of the chaos that had preceded it. The battle had been won, but the war had left its marks on everyone, even me. As I turned to head back home, I found myself reflecting on what had really changed. The system had been exposed, but I knew there were still others like Margaret out there, hidden in the shadows, pulling the strings. But now, I wasn't afraid to fight back. And maybe that's the real victory, the realization that there's always a way to fight back, even when it feels like you're outmatched, outnumbered, or unheard. If you've ever felt like you were up against a force bigger than yourself, this story is for you. The fight for what's right isn't always easy, and sometimes standing up means risking everything. But when you've been pushed far enough, the question becomes, do you stay silent or do you fight back? Take a moment to reflect on your own battles, whether personal or professional. What would you do if you had the power to expose the truth? What's the price of standing up, and are you willing to pay it? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience, courage, and the fight for justice. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the fight for fairness starts with one voice, and yours might just be the one that sparks change.